Hello, this is Dr. Irene Hausinger, and this is the lecture to accompany Chapter 6 of your Uppers, Downers, All-Arounders book. We will be talking about all-arounders. All-arounders, also known as hallucinogens, are psychedelics that can act like stimulants or depressants. Most of these drugs alter a person's perceptions and create a world in which reason takes a back seat to intensified sensations marked by illusions, delusions, and hallucinations. Humans have used them for tens of thousands of years to cope with their fears and the environment. They are used for religious, social, ceremonial, and medical purposes. Psychedelics were originally found in some of the 4,000 plants and fungi that had psychoactive effects. Over the past century, thousands of psychedelics have been synthesized. LSD, psilocybin mushrooms, peyote, MDMA, ketamine, DMT, PCP, and especially marijuana are the most commonly used all-arounders. The 5 general categories are indoles, phenylkylamines, anticholinergics, miscellaneous psychedelics like PCP, and cannabinoids. Synthetic marijuana was developed to be undetectable in drug tests and is available in various forms and products, such as spice. In addition to the toxicity, the effects of many psychedelics are dependent on the amount of drug ingested or dosing. A drug like LSD is thousands of times more powerful by weight than a similar amount of peyote. Other factors also help determine the type, duration, and intensity of the effects, and some of that has to do with if it's synthesized or if it's a naturally occurring substance. Especially for psychedelics, the following are really important. We talk about set and setting. So the emotional makeup of the user. Are they prone to anxiety? Are they prone to anger, etc.? The user's mood and mental state at the time of use, the surroundings in which the drug is taken, experience with the drug, and pre-existing mental illnesses. Psychedelics cause intensified and cross sensations such as synesthesia, which is hearing colors. Visual input becomes sound. Psychedelics cause illusions, which are mistaken perceptions or real stimuli. Delusions are mistaken beliefs that are not swayed by reason. And hallucination, which are imaginary sensory experiences. An illusion, a mistaken perception of real stimuli. So, for example, if a tree starts to talk to you when you're on mushrooms. Delusions, mistaken beliefs that are not swayed by reason. Hallucinations, imaginary sensory experiences. So, for example, imagining that or feeling that you have bugs or things crawling on your skin versus a delusion, like really believing that you're hearing the voice of God or something like that. There are YouTube videos that you can watch that mimic what it would be like to be on hallucinogens. They're a little weird. Traditionally, psychedelic mushrooms are used to induce visions to help treat illnesses, solve problems, or connect with the spirit world. So one of the things that we really have to look at with all substances, but especially with hallucinogens, are what is the intention of the use. Indole psychedelics exert many of their effects through serotonin receptors, which affect mood, sleep, anxiety, and areas of the brain that generate hallucinations and illusions. LSD is naturally found in ergot fungus toxin growing on rye grains. It was extracted by Dr. Albert Hofmann in 1938. LSD is very potent in both its natural and its synthetic forms. It lasts 6 to 8 hours, causing stimulation, mood changes, loss of judgment, sensory distortions, hallucinations, and illusions. When someone has a bad emotional reaction to the drug, it's considered a bad trip. Initially popularized by Dr. Timothy Leary and writer Ken Kesey in the 1960s, LSD was studied as an aid to investigating thought processes. The history of LSD is really interesting. The CIA experimented on its own people, on police officers. They had an operation called Operation Midnight, where they lured CIA agents in with prostitutes and administered LSD to them without their knowledge. So it's a pretty interesting. It's got a pretty interesting history. Psychedelic or magic mushrooms, the other major indole psychedelic, contains psilocybin and psilocin. More than 100 species contain the active ingredients. They cause nausea and induce hallucinations. Effects include visceral sensations, changes in sight, hearing, taste, and touch, and altered consciousness. Other indole psychedelics have limited availability. Ibogaine, morning glory seeds. Morning glory grows like crazy in the Northwest. DMT, ayahuasca, foxy, and AMT. You may hear a little bit more about ibogaine in terms of treatment. Sometimes it is used for opiate addictions. Ibogaine, found mostly in Africa, produces long-acting psychedelic effects, illusions, and hallucinations, producing deep introspective states. It is being used experimentally to treat alcohol, cocaine, and opioid addiction. DMT is a quick-acting psychedelic often used in ayahuasca, a concoction of vines and plants found mostly in South America that is used in ceremonies to gain personal insights. In the U.S., there is one state that has a Church of the Ayahuasca, and they were granted the ability to use ayahuasca under religious protection, but it's not something that is often readily available. And then there are ethics involved with ayahuasca and some of the other indigenous psychedelics because it's become popular among wealthy white people, and so they go to the Amazon and they go to different places, and these are sacred plants that have been growing for a very long time, and there really isn't the ability to cultivate them in mass, and so it then becomes an issue of cultural appropriation and something that's being used for profit, and so there is an ethical issue here as well. Peyote, MDMA, and other phenylalkylamine. There we go. Phenylalkylamine. Say that 5 times fast and I'll give you extra credit. These are chemically related to adrenaline and amphetamine. There's mescaline, which is the peyote cacti, and it produces more hallucinations than LSD and is often used in sacred rituals and ceremonies to generate visions, and its effects last about 12 hours. Psychostimulants are phenethylamine derivatives such as MDMA, MDA, and 2CB. MDMA, also known as ecstasy, releases excess serotonin, causing a sense of well-being, empathy, and calm, along with stimulatory effects. Molly is pure MDMA, usually in capsule form. Patrons of raves and music dance clubs favor MDMA, marijuana, purple drink, also known as lean, and to a lesser extent ketamine, nitrous oxide, GHB, and dextromethorphan. Next, we have the anticholinergic psychedelics like belladonna, which is deadly nightshade, henbane, mandrake, and datura, Jimson weed or thorn apple. Plants such as belladonna, henbane, and Jimson weed have been used in rituals of ancient cultures for more than 3,000 years, mostly to induce visions. Their active ingredients are hysokamine, atropine, and scopolamine. These drugs speed up the heart, raise body temperature, and cause a separation from reality. About 1,000 Jimson weed poisonings occur in the United States every year. So a lot of these are very potent, and a little bit can be toxic. Next, we have PCP, ketamine, salvia divorum, and other psychedelics. PCP is an anesthetic used on animals. In humans, it causes mind-body separation, a sensory-deprived state, and hallucinations. Ketamine is a similar anesthetic and produces many of the same effects. PCP and ketamine are also known as dissociative anesthetics. Ketamine is being used in Washington State and other states for in therapy, in conjunction with talk therapy, in cases where people have extreme PTSD or chronic pain and for which other modalities have not been very effective. There are ketamine treatment centers in Pierce County and King County, and it's not just, oh, here's some ketamine. They can either administer it in an IV or they can administer it in a nasal spray called S-ketamine. And then they monitor you for 2 to 3 hours afterwards to make sure that you are not having a bad trip and that you are safe to leave if you are driving yourself. Salvia Divinorum is a small sage plant, and it contains salvinorin a short-acting psychedelic chemical that causes hallucinations, delirium, out-of-body sensations, along with an ability to communicate or function physically. It was at one point legal in Washington. I'm not sure if it still is, but they usually sell it at head shops, and the high lasts about 15 minutes. Amanita mushrooms can cause a dreamy intoxication, hallucinations, and delirious excitement, but they can be deadly if too much is used. So then again, we have the issue with dosing. Dosing is very, very important. They're legal in the United States and are usually acquired over the internet. Dextromethorphan is a non-prescription cough suppressant that can cause psychedelic effects and health liabilities when used to excess, so rubber tripping. High concentrations can cause psychoactive and psychedelic effects. It is kept behind the counter in pharmacies or available only with a prescription. Nutmeg and mace are also psychedelics, but are rarely used because the psychedelic effects come at the expense of making one sick. Another all-arounder is found at raves is Bromo dragonfly and lion's tail, Leonidas lenoris. An HIV/AIDS medication, Sestiva, is sometimes used to induce lightheadedness, dizziness, vivid dreams, hallucinations, and other effects. And we're going to talk about endocannabinoids and marijuana. Endocannabinoids are naturally occurring neurochemicals that bind to receptor sites. So with neurotransmitters, the reason that substances can work on our bodies is because we have these endogenous substances in our brain that are very similar to the chemicals. If we didn't, then the chemicals wouldn't get us high. For example, there is a honeybee in the Himalayas, and they make hallucinogenic honey because they pollinate a hallucinogenic plant. Now, honeybees do not have receptors, or they do not have the indigenous chemicals in the brain, so they don't trip out. However, people have fallen to their death trying to get this psychedelic honey because it's high up on a mountain. So if you eat psychedelic honey, you can have a trip, but the honeybees that make the psychedelic honey, they don't have that brain chemistry. So for them, it's just regular honey. I encourage you to look this up. This isn't something I made up. It's actually real. Okay. Cannabis is not a purified drug. It contains over 420 different compounds. The most well-known delta-9 THC is psychoactive. The other two ligands are cannabidiol, CBD, and cannabinol. These two produce a negligible high but have the greatest number of medical effects. Marijuana, cannabis sativa, and cannabis indica are the most popular psychoactive drugs. It is used by 19 million Americans on a monthly basis, possibly more now. Historically, China, India, and many other countries use marijuana as a food, a medicine, a fiber, and a psychedelic. Marijuana has been alternatively permitted and made illegal in some states. So we know that this book was written in 2014. There has been a lot of change since then. More and more states are adding at least medical marijuana and lots of time recreational marijuana. Federally, it is illegal, but in different states, it is legal to sell for rec and medical purposes. The major two species of marijuana are cannabis sativa and cannabis indica. The active psychedelic ingredient is delta-9 tetrahydrocannabinol, or simply THC. Using sinsemilla growing techniques, the potency of the THC can be greatly increased. The average THC in the United States is more than 13%. It's very fancy now. If you go to a dispensary or a rec shop, they can tell you exactly how much you have in them, like the percentage of the CBD, the percentage of the THC. It gets very, very specific. Sativa, this is how I remember, sativa for the brain. This is something that people might use to stimulate themselves. And indica couch. So indicas generally tend to make people a little bit more sedate. People might use that if they are using medicinally to go to bed, whereas sativas tend to be a little bit stimulating for people. Sativa for the brain, indica couch. Hashish is the concentrated resin of the cannabis indica plant. The method of making hashish using butane, BHO, butane hash oil, or butane honey oil, is alcohol, CO2, or ice water is called dabbing. Another name for a slightly different process for making concentrated THC is shattered glass and amber. And there are pictures in your book on how it is made by extracting the crystals on the buds, and it comes out into this honey type concoction, and then you bake it, and then you take a dab nail, and then you take a dab rig, and the dab rigs kind of look like hardcore drug paraphernalia. And one of the things that we're having now is that the THC can get up to 99% pure, and people are going to the ER for dab psychosis, because if they're not used to having THC, it's not like flower or an edible. It's very, very pure and concentrated. There's really not much you can do for a marijuana overdose. Overdose means that you've taken too big of a dose. It does not mean that you're dying or you're convulsing. Okay? So you can overdose. You can overdose on capsaicin. You can have too many jalapeno poppers and overdose yourself and turn bright red. It happens. So overdose does not necessarily mean that you're dying or your body is shutting down. It means that you've taken too big of a dose. Okay. All right. Most marijuana comes through Mexico or is grown in the United States, where distribution is often controlled by Mexican drug trafficking organizations. More indoor growing is taking place to avoid surveillance. Cannabis does not produce rapid onset withdrawal symptoms. Only after a relatively long period of abstinence do withdrawal symptoms appear, and they're similar to others. So again, the withdrawal symptoms are usually the opposite of the high. So anger, irritability, anxiety, aches, pains, and chills, depression, the inability to concentrate, sweating, and craving. These structural formulas show the method of designation for psychedelics that is used in this chapter. Notice that the indole alkylamine core is the same for all indole psychedelics, and the phenylalkylamine core is the same for all the phenylalkylamine psychedelics. Similar cores usually deliver similar effects. Again, if you can prove to me that you can say that word 5 times fast, I'll give you extra credit. Great. This is a picture of a mature peyote cactus, and it's used in many spiritual ceremonies by the Native American Church. Each button, which is the top there, contains about 50 milligrams of mescaline. It can take 2 to 10 buttons to produce psychoactive effects. So again, dosing is really important. It depends on weight. It can depend on gender. It can depend on a lot of different things. It can depend on how much is in the actual plant substance as well. Okay. These are ecstasy pills that were intercepted by the DEA. Much of the smuggling was done by Canadian-based Chinese gangs. A capsule powdered form called Molly is ecstasy of choice, but tablet and capsule often contain other chemicals ranging from methamphetamine and ephedrine to MDA, PCP, and PMA, and sometimes heroin as well. So one of the dangers with ecstasy is not knowing what it's cut with. So if you don't use heroin at all and your pill contains maybe 3% heroin, and you have more than one, you could potentially overdose. There are organizations like Seattle-based Dance Safe that sell testing kits so that you can test, it's an iodine-based testing kit, so you can see the purity of the substance. And they also sell other testing kits. It's become more and more popular to cut drugs with different things, including cat dewormer, baking soda, fentanyl, etc. So it is advisable that you do test your drugs as a harm reduction method. Okay. So again, dosing is very important. Just like with pharmaceuticals, the dose for something that is helpful and harmful can vary greatly and can be marginal. PCP and ketamine were originally developed as anesthetics, but were eventually used as animal tranquilizers. Ketamine, there are different types of ketamine, is really the only one that's used in veterinary medicine right now. PCP is also sometimes known as SHRM because basically PCP is like a embalming type fluid, and they would dip SHRM cigarettes into it and then smoke it. But it causes a lot of erratic issues. And when you hear about people on PCP, one of the common stories is feeling like they have wings and jumping off of buildings. Okay, so this is a picture of salvia. It's legal in a lot of states, but some states have passed laws against it. Usually it's dried and you might make it into a tea or chew on the leaves. This is an Amanita muscaria mushroom. It's a pretty famous mushroom. You usually see this depicted in art. Okay. When you take the 402 class with me, we watched this film, Reefer Madness. It was a propaganda film designed to scare people, and the way that they portray marijuana in it is very much like methamphetamine or PCP. Other films include Marijuana, Weed with Roots in Hell, and The Devil's Harvest. They exploited sensationalism that surrounded psychoactive drugs. And a lot of this was a ploy to make marijuana illegal, so that other forms of agriculture instead of hemp would be popular, such as lumber. And so what they would do is they would take stories. There was a case of a young boy in Florida, and they said that he smoked a joint and then murdered his family. What they didn't tell you is that he was schizophrenic. So during this propaganda time, there was a lot of information that was misused intentionally to create public support for making marijuana illegal. Okay. So we know that since 2013, smoking tobacco has gone down for teenagers, but smoking marijuana has gone up. There's a documentary from the BBC called America's Stoned Kids, which you might want to take a look at, which has some great information in it. And a lot of this reflects the public opinion that's shifted, that marijuana is not very harmful, and most of this increased drastically when marijuana became legal, especially in Washington and Colorado in 2013. Okay. Now, smoking anything organic can have effects on the lungs. So here we have a healthy mucous membrane of a non-smoker, and a mucous membrane of a marijuana smoker, and then a mucous membrane of someone that smokes cigarettes and marijuana. And you can see that there are very big differences here. One of the things that you can do to reduce harm is to switch to edibles. However, edibles can sometimes last 8 to 12 hours. You can also vape marijuana, and without all the additives, it might be less harsh on the lungs there, depending on what's in it. Okay. There are hundreds of different versions of synthetic marijuana. They are all produced from chemicals that have not had any clinical trials to demonstrate that they are safe. When they become obviously unsafe, what manufacturers will do is they'll yank it, they'll change 1 or 2 ingredients because those ingredients have become illegal, and then they'll release it under another name very easily. They're usually 5 to 800 times stronger than cannabis, and they've been known to produce psychosis resulting in psychiatric emergencies. Synthetic cannabinoids sold under the trade names Spice Silver, Spice Gold, and K2, among others, are gaining popularity. They do not act like marijuana and can cause psychosis. Okay. So here we see blood and urine levels in marijuana. Because traces of marijuana remain in urine longer than in the blood, a person can test positive for the drug even though he or she is not impaired. Remember that marijuana is fat soluble and does stay in the brain. And this also depends on how long you've been smoking. If you smoke marijuana once, it'll be out of your system fairly quickly. I have a chart that I will give to you that shows you exactly how long each substance stays in your body and how long it can be detected in your blood, urine, and hair follicles, because that does change. Most of the medical benefits of marijuana, such as pain relief and seizure control, seem not to come from THC, but from cannabidiol and its effect on CB1 and CB2 receptors. It is of note to state that CBD is legal in all 50 states. In Washington state, where marijuana is legal, as well as CBD, if you go to a marijuana store and you want a CBD product, they can't have just CBD in it. By law, for rec stores in Washington, if you go to buy a CBD product, it has to have at least 2 milligrams of THC in it. So if you're going to buy something for pain and you can't have THC in it, then you can go to a store that is CBD only. And there are a lot of different CBD stores, and there are a lot of CBD retailers online as well. We mentioned earlier that researchers have discovered more than 420 chemicals in a single cannabis plant. At least 30 of these chemicals, called cannabinoids, are studied for their psychoactive effects. The brain's natural THC is called anandamide. Marijuana can cause relaxation, sedation, increased appetite, a heightened sense of novelty, giddiness, bloodshot eyes, short-term memory impairment, not necessarily long-term, impaired tracking ability, respiratory impairment, and mental confusion. Excess chronic use of marijuana can cause hyperemesis, which is violent vomiting, a condition that reoccurs until the person stops smoking or using. Sometimes it's called being green sick. Marijuana is called the mirror that magnifies. It also has a strong effect on the novelty center of the brain, which is normally stimulated by anandamide. The impairment of the novelty center makes learning more difficult. Tolerance, withdrawal symptoms, and addiction occur with chronic marijuana use. Nearly 336,000 Americans sought treatment for marijuana dependence addiction in 1 year. More and more people are getting arrested for impaired driving while under the influence of marijuana, although most stoned drivers drive under the speed limit. Harvard had conducted a study about this, and they found that marijuana users are more likely to wait at stop signs for longer periods of time. And in some cases may have decreased traffic accidents. I am not advocating for anyone to drive under the influence of marijuana, but they tend to get into less accidents in terms of intersections. But do not use and drive, please. Okay. There have been intense social and legal battles over the use of marijuana for medical purposes, but now that more states are using it, there's more research going into it, and with Canada legalizing a couple years ago, most experts do agree that America will fully have it legalized at some point. Between 51 and 61% of Americans are pro-legalization. Medical marijuana is used to control pain, some forms of glaucoma, nausea, and anxiety. Many medical needs presented as a rationale for obtaining a medical marijuana card are exaggerated. Oh my god, I stubbed my toe. A legitimate medical marijuana doctor is going to want all of your medical records, and then there's certainly ones that you just pay them $150. But the legalization of marijuana is destined to cause conflicts among federal and state governments and law enforcement agencies, and you will see that from time to time popping up in the news where there are DEA raids. Okay. See you next week.